let other people join us as they arrive. Again, if you'd prefer, please change your name in Zoom to include your pronouns and your role in the coalition. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Happy New Year. We are very happy that you are able to join us this evening. We hope that you were able to take some time off during the holidays to rest and rejuvenate. So we're looking forward to refreshed minds and energetic participation and a whole lot of bright, new, encouraging ideas around the work that's ahead of us. I want to especially welcome our Southeast Guiding Coalition members and the community at large. I also want to extend our welcome to our board of directors and PPS staff. We also want to continue our welcome by extending our gratitude to JED and Flow Analytics, who have worked alongside us since the very beginning of this work, Karina and Brick Architectural Firm, and our principals. At our last meeting, we continued discussions about the three proposals shared with the intention of narrowing our options as we work towards a recommendation. Tonight, we will revisit our charter and decision-making process so it is fresh in our minds. However, before we proceed, I'd like to engage in our land acknowledgement and just honor our native. Quick reminder, the meeting is being recorded. Just so you are aware of that. Again, at PPS, then I'm going to go ahead and read the land acknowledgement. At PPS, we strive to strengthen our relationships with the Native community and Native nations. A symbol of this commitment is a land acknowledgement. These statements bring visibility to the First Peoples of our collective home. This statement is meant to provide information and context while also encouraging all of us to reflect on our current day relationships with Native people and the Native experiences. We acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional land of the Chinook, Clackamas, Kalapuya, Multnomah, Wasco, Tualatin, and Malala peoples. We also know that many other tribes made their homes along the Columbia and Willamette rivers. We honor their history and acknowledge the sacrifice they made. Let us also acknowledge the robust present-day federally recognized tribes of this area, the Grand Ronde, the Siletz, and the Cowlitz. In addition, I would like to acknowledge the Chinook Nation, who has been seeking federal recognition for many years. The urban Indian community is made up of tribal diversity that originates from around the country, representing 400 tribes. The urban Indian community has a vivid history made up of people whose journeys have brought them to Portland by ways of forced displacement or seeking more opportunities. Next slide, please. Today, these tribes and communities celebrate their heritage, showing resilience and tenacity that will be greatly admired by their ancestors. Within Portland Public Schools today, we serve students and families representing more than 150 different tribal nations within our education system. It is our obligation to teach accurate information, past and present, about the impact of colonization on our students, all students today, and make visible the multitude of Native families and many diverse ways Native communities and families are living in the present. We encourage every person to reflect on their own history, understand the history of colonization and genocide, and support Indigenous sovereignty, priorities, and actions. This acknowledgement is one step that we can take towards improving our support of Indigenous communities in the area. In addition to acknowledging the land and those who have been here since time began, we must also remember our stolen siblings from Africa, whose labor built the vast wealth of this country. These two communities and the atrocities committed against them are intrinsically intertwined due to our existence within a white supremacist world. Everything we have is due to stolen land and stolen labor, and every system and institution that impacts our lives is built upon this legacy. It is our job to speak that truth into spaces so that we can begin to heal. Next slide, please. Our agenda tonight is, of course, reviewing our charter and decision-making process. We will have the opportunity to listen to our transportation liaison. There were a lot of questions that came up in our small group sessions around transportation. We'll also have the opportunity to listen to our co-chairs. They have updates from the community and from their participation in different small group sessions. We will have the opportunity to also listen to our program focus group work presenters or leads in our breakout sessions. At the end, we'll of course look into our next steps. Next slide, please. That said, I do want to turn the meeting over to Karina.
Thank you, Dr. O. So again, welcome. We're happy to be back tonight, and hoping that we can start to get our focus really on the program placements. Want to focus everyone again, as we always do, on our group agreements, the 8 that you see here in front of you. Really want folks to stay engaged in the conversation, to ensure that you're speaking your truth responsibly, and that we're listening to each other, right? Not necessarily to understand, but certainly to believe. So we don't always have to understand the perspective, but we have to honor that the perspective being shared is a real lived experience that has value. And be willing to do things differently and experience discomfort, right? These are topics that are often have a lot of passion behind them. And so want to acknowledge that, but understand that we need to do this in a respectful way, to expect and accept non-closure. Hopefully by the end of tonight, we've at least gotten a little bit closer to closure on program placement. And then, as we always do, remember to take space and make space. We will be sure to monitor that as best we can during the small group breakouts, and just kind of move forward with that. Are there any suggestions? We know you've lived with these for a while. Is there anything that you feel that you need tonight in particular that would allow you to participate more fully in these conversations? Okay, next. So to kind of add on to what Dr. O said earlier, that know that for those of you that are watching this live, the public will not be able to listen live to any work that happens in the breakout rooms. However, those sessions will be recorded and will be available on the Enrollment and Program Balancing website by tomorrow afternoon. So that's a good reminder for the facilitators of each of those rooms to ensure that we record them. And with that, we're going to transition to our CoChair Corner. Unfortunately tonight, Adriel is not able to join us. She's not feeling well. But fortunately for us, we do have Beth Kavanaugh with us tonight, who can share any feedbacks from the co-chair's perspective. Beth?
Hi, I don't have a ton to say tonight, so I'll keep it really brief. I want to acknowledge that so far our coffee chats that we've had have only been on Fridays at noon, which I know does not work for everyone and was not the intention to sort of stick with one schedule like that. However, spoiler alert, later in tonight's meeting, we're going to be floating some potential additional SCGC meetings. So the original plan was that next week, or that this round, our coffee chat would be next Thursday evening, since there's not currently a meeting planned, but potentially there could be. So I don't know. We're going to leave that open right now because neither Adriel or I are available tomorrow at noon for a coffee chat anyway. But depending on if we've got additional meetings happening, we may not have the capacity for the coffee chats anyway. So I just want to throw that out there. There's nothing on the calendar right now for an upcoming coffee chat, but please reach out to Adriel, reach out to me to let us know what's on your mind. I think that all of us over the break I haven't heard from folks over the break in terms of stuff to bring to attention for this CoChair Corner right now. I think mostly we'll be hearing from the small groups and sort of the things that rose to the top for those, and hopefully that'll kind of cover it. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to transition now to you, Claire.
Good evening. I am, first of all, I'd want to start off by thanking Director Brim Edwards for joining us tonight. Thank you. It's always nice to have a board member here listening to what the Guiding Coalition has to say. And are there any other board members here tonight? I just want to make sure I'm not missing somebody, but that's the one that I know of. The next thing is I have spent time reviewing breakout sessions, and I would just want to compliment the groups on how they're working together. So I think when you're in one group, you don't know how the other groups are doing, and the benefit of seeing all three groups and the progress that's being made. And it's what's really helpful is, people are really being collaborative and really working together to find a solution. And as the group is moving forward, we're starting to see things that are fitting together, so that while one group is working on one program, we're actually seeing the outcome of that work kind of align to and fit together with another group. So still probably, I would say our Chinese DLI and our creative science are fitting together in their proposals really well in terms of how they're bringing things forward. And I think the Spanish group has one of the most difficult jobs, because there's so many Spanish DLI programs in the region. And certainly we're all there to support you as you continue to find solutions. So I just wanted to compliment the groups on the work that's been done to date, and appreciate the progress that's being made as we're looking at programs tonight. The next is I'd like to introduce you to Lisa Wheeler. Lisa, can we spotlight Lisa Wheeler for me? She's our transportation liaison. She's a routing manager for Portland Public Schools. And so she is our expert on routes for buses. And so she's going to join us for our meetings coming forward as we're getting to focusing down to more concrete proposals. And while she may not be able to answer every question in the moment, she'll be able to research and bring things back as well. But welcome, Lisa. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Claire. I'm happy to be here. I will definitely try to answer as many questions as I can.
Great. Thank you. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to remind us, especially as people have been asking about the decision-making process, we have a charter document that really is how we do our work and the guidelines for our process. We brought it to you first in May, just to kind of talk about the process. And then the last time we've actually brought it to the group was back in September. So it's just a reminder that there's lots of, a lot of it you see sometimes in the slides are working agreements, but there's also a section on decision making. So I just wanted to talk about that for a minute. And so the Southeast Guiding Coalition is working right now to build consensus around especially program placement before we go on to the boundaries. And then you would develop a recommendation to bring forward to me as Deputy Superintendent by February. And then I would review it and would have the ability to modify if there's something that needs to be modified before forwarding it to the board. And they would be making their decision in March. So I just wanted to, they will have at least 2 meetings, one to bring the proposal forward and have a discussion, and the second then to make their final decision. So with that, I want to add one other thing, and I don't know if Margaret Calvert has had a chance to join us this evening. And if not, then could you bring Esther, Dr. O, forward? I've had more conversations with our instructional leaders on DLI, especially around the middle school DLI programs, as we listen to the conversations coming from our breakout sessions and some questions about that placement for middle schools. And so the instructional leaders had a conversation about that, and I would ask Dr. O to share with us the outcomes of that conversation.
Right. So we met yesterday to discuss DLI at the middle school level. One of the things that we did discuss, and this is in light of Lane, is what it would take to create a sustainable academic program for the number of students that are in the DLI program at Lane. Lane currently does have the Russian DLI program, but there aren't enough students in there. So when we realized this, we started looking at options for how to actually also continue to build a DLI program and how to also support the growth of the numbers at the school. So we considered maybe moving the Chinese DLI program, a portion of it, to Lane. The challenge then becomes having 2 DLI programs at the middle school, because that requires specific kinds of staffing and additional kinds of resources to, number 1, grow the program, number 2, provide support for the teacher, and number 3, enable the program to continue to sustain itself through the middle grades all onto the high school. So what we decided is that in rare cases, we may have to actually do that. We may have no other option than to honor that. But then we started looking at what that would entail and what would be involved, and the resources and the costs and so on and so forth. So there is a possibility that at schools like Lane that are outliers, we may end up having 2 DLI programs. We just have to be strategic about the staffing and the supports for such schools.
And Dr. O, would the same be true at Harrison Park when we look at the Mandarin program?
Yes, the same would be true at Harrison Park when we look at the Mandarin program, because they do not have enough students to create a robust program there, and would like to grow that program in that community as well.
Thank you, Dr. O. I appreciate that conversation. And then I think I'm handing it off to you, as I think you have the next set of slides. Dr. O needs to come back. Great, thank you.
Yes, now I am back. So we spent some time looking at the data that we currently have around our co-located Chinese and Spanish DLI programs. On that note, I do want to introduce Susan Mullen. Susan Mullen works for the PPS Research and Accountability Department. She has spent a lot of time looking at the data, trying to answer questions, and narrowing it down to ensure that we do have the responses that we need. The data tonight is not going to necessarily address the DLI program, but it will address the DLI program within the context of a co-located program. It will also be looking at the neighborhood side of the program, because we heard a lot of questions about that too, that it seems as if we do a lot of talking around the DLI, but not much has been said about the neighborhood program. That said, I would like to turn the meeting over to Ms. Susan Mullen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dr. O. And I also want to say I'm a parent, a PPS parent. I really appreciate all the, the effort and the dialogue and the considerations that this group has done so far. With that being said, to that point, right, I've become involved, I'd say, in the last month or so, given some questions that surfaced related to the data, data that maybe that Flow did not have access to. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. You know, and I want you to keep in mind too that this is in the absence of within PPS, because that's the data we're going to look at. Within PPS, we don't have a whole school DLI model that has enough data and history of data to be able to do some comparisons. And so in the absence of that, what we're going to do is try to find some appropriate subpopulations to do some comparisons to. And really the way that we're going to look at this is kind of within 2 prisms. One is a need versus resource allocation. And then the second is in performance, you know, to do with testing. Can we go to the next slide? So on a high level, we're going to dive into some of this, but here are kind of the key things that we found so far. Within a co-located school, we see the rates of direct certification are consistently higher for neighborhood strands. which can lead to disparities when funding is allocated at a school level. And so direct certification, we can think of as a proxy for socioeconomic status. You could also think of it as free meals. That's one thing we'll look at later. The second thing is when we control for direct certification rates, we consistently see lower performance on our SBAC, our Smarter Balance state assessments for students in the neighborhood strand at co-located schools when compared to their peers at traditional neighborhood schools, with the exception of our highest SES or lowest direct certification schools. And then third, when we look at Chinese and Spanish LEP, that's limited English proficient students, in immersion programs, we see a higher performance on the English and language arts tests than their peers who are also entering in kindergarten as Chinese and Spanish LEP, but did not attend an immersion program. And so I think what you're seeing here, hopefully, is that like we're kind of drilling into some subpopulations as opposed to just saying DLI versus not DLI. We're kind of drilling in to say, can we find some groups that are comparable to see if there is some disparity? Next slide, please. So the first bullet, again, direct certification, right, is we can think of it as free meals and the rates of students who qualify. Why direct certification is a little bit different is it's given to us from state agencies. And as opposed to where you have situations where a whole school can get free lunch, this is, I would say, a more accurate measure on a student level. So the first question, right, is like, do neighborhood strands have higher direct certification rates at co-located schools? And the answer is like resoundingly yes. You're going to see this when the blue bar is longer than the orange marker. The blue bar represents the percent in neighborhood. So the percent of the students in the neighborhood strand that qualify, that are direct certification. The orange bar is within the overall school. And so that's when we see the disparity, is when the neighborhood strand has higher rates of direct certification than the school overall. And like I said, because we have situations where funding is assigned to the whole school, that's where we might see some disparities in a need versus resource allocation. We're looking at this chart is for school years 20 and 21. And you see the schools that are highlighted are the schools that would likely be impacted by the SEGC decisions. We'll just pause there for any comments or questions.
Again, if you want to raise your hand or enter a question into the chat.
And if a question does surface in chat, if someone could, oh, here we go.
Sure.
That's a good question. So what we're trying to just do is shine light in where we can shine light in this process. And so what we're doing is we only have co-located schools. We don't have a whole school model to compare it to. But what we want to at least highlight is, are there differences in co-located schools compared to if it was just a neighborhood school, right? Because of the fact that in this case, this is a unique case, right, where we see funding is allocated to a school level. We see some situations where the rates, we see a situation here happening where the rates are higher at direct certification in neighborhood, which could be a function of many things, one of which being self-selection of the population that chooses to do the immersion strand if it is a co-located school versus not having an option. Good question. So we chose not to include Russian, Vietnamese, or Japanese immersions in this process, just because number one, they wouldn't be directly impacted immediately by this decision. But number two, because it's a very different model, Japanese is a whole school, but not necessarily comparable to the populations that we're talking about here in Southeast Guiding Coalition. I'm having trouble following. Let me open up the. Can someone translate the chats to me, I guess, as we go through? That'd be super helpful.
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so can we see the data for Richmond, or can you explain why that school isn't relevant here? I think you might have done that. And then there was a follow-up statement that says Mount Tabor.
Good question. So the schools included in this analysis were the schools that are currently like our K-5 schools. So we did not include the middle schools in this initial analysis.
And then this isn't a question, but I know this to be true, so I want you to talk to it about if there are situations where there are programs, but they are so small that any reporting of the data would get down to the student level, right? That there's you have a threshold below which you won't report. Will you talk a little bit about that, Suzanne?
That's right. We definitely do that. In this case, we did not even come close to that threshold, but in situations with very small programs, we would, and especially with this metric, we would be very guarded about raising or highlighting those rates.
I'm not seeing any further questions on this slide.
Okay.
So what you're saying, Suzanne, is that if there was any data that you could actually pick out who the student was, we wouldn't ever drill down to that level.
Exactly.
Correct?
That's
Thank
right.
you.
Can you talk a little bit more? We're getting some questions or some
Sure.
Confusion about why Richmond's data isn't relevant to this process.
I think in the simplest answer for that is it's not one of the schools that would be impacted by any of the proposals that were put forth. And so for the sake of staying focused on the decisions that this group is going to be making, we chose to include these schools.
I think there's also a difference, Suzanne, but if I've got this incorrect, please correct me, is that we have emerging bilinguals in our Chinese and Mandarin program, where with our Japanese program, that isn't, it's not necessarily a dual language immersion program. I'm not the instructional expert, and I welcome someone that is better at this than I am to speak, but Richmond is Japanese and isn't necessarily one of the reasons we have the bilingual Spanish program is so that a native Spanish speaker can learn to read in Spanish, where most of our Japanese program, if I'm not mistaken, are not native speakers. But please correct me if I've got that wrong, but I believe that's one of the main differences.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say, yeah, just to go back is if we were to do some comparisons, and you'll see these later on in the slide, when we're going to do some comparisons of students who are LEP, limited English proficient or emergent, we're going to compare within language. And so again, like Richmond was a school that would not be impacted by the decision. And some of the click down analysis that we're doing are on a language level. And that would just then render Richmond in that case, not relevant.
I think the other point that Beth made, which I think is a good one, is this particular comparison is between rates at co-located schools where you've got a percentage of neighborhood and a percentage of in the school. Right. And Richmond does not have any neighborhood students.
That's right. And yes, that's a good point for this slide. But and when we talk about the entire deck, there are some situations that yes, that's true. Yes,
so why don't we maybe move on to the next slide? I'll keep tracking questions. Yeah.
Okay, so we kind of highlighted that, right? Just to like bring us back, right? Where we're seeing potential disparities when we have co-located schools, potentially because of that, that we have the two and an availability of an immersion at a co-located school. But nonetheless, we see a disparity between the direct certification rates. So second thing we said we were going to look at was performance. Kind of what I mentioned earlier is, right, so now we're doing that click in. So students who enter in kindergarten and are limited English proficient, and their home language is Spanish. That's what we're going to look at here. And so the question we're addressing is, do Spanish LEP students meet ELA standards more frequently if they're in an immersion program? The immersion students are represented by the orange bar. The students who are also entered as Spanish LEP students in kindergarten, but not in an immersion, are represented by the blue bar. This does reinforce some peer-reviewed evaluations that have been done, where we see in 3rd and 4th grade, the students in the immersion program are a little bit lacking in standardized testing. But then as the students progress through in their tenure at school, we see 5th grade, 7th grade very much meeting standards at a higher rate. And then for the other years, kind of on par. So I just want to kind of point out for folks who might not know, we're looking at percent of students who are meeting standards. That's what this graph is reflecting, the percentages. And it's 3rd through 8th grade for school year 16, 17, 18. Those are the most recent 3 years of data we have.
Not seeing any additional questions or hands. Anyone? I'm going to give it a minute though. Some clarification happening between one of our co-chairs and folks, but I don't see any additional questions. Okay, Suzanne, maybe we jump to the next slide.
Next slide, very much related.
Oh, hold on. Oh. All right. So one of the things that we're seeing here, and this I'm doing this off the fly here, is
sure.
Again, just talking about Richmond, right? That Richmond isn't a clear comparison because regardless, the socioeconomic demographics there are so much higher than the other immersion programs that we would be looking at, and the program isn't intended to be serving emerging speakers, so language. Yeah, okay, no questions, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, next slide. So we're looking at a very similar slide, but this time we're looking at those students who enter kindergarten as limited English proficient with Chinese as their home language. Again, the orange bar represents those students who are in an immersion program. This one we see consistently across all the grades where the students who are in an immersion program are meeting standards in English language, the SBAC scores more frequently. Here you see that grades 6th, 7th, and 8th have no data, and that is because we didn't include the middle schools in this initial analysis, and so Hosford was not included. And that's just why we don't see it represented here. To bring it back to like the summary slide that we looked at, that's kind of what we're talking about is when we look at students. So SBAC is a smarter balance assessment. And so that is the standardized state test that students take. And ELA is the English language and English and language arts portion. So just to bring it back to that summary slide, it was the second bullet I think that we talked about was, or potentially the third, when we look at students who enter as LEP, those that attend an immersion program in their native language outperform their peers who do not attend an immersion program.
Any data regarding high school scores / graduation rates?
Yeah, I think it's just the runway of time that we have didn't allow necessarily for that addition of analysis, but you know, if it's something that this group feels that they need, we can definitely we can work with Judy and Dr. O to potentially pull it. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about those students who are in the neighborhood strand. And so the question we're going to address here is, when we control for direct certification status, how do co-located neighborhood strands perform on the state tests compared to peers in a traditional neighborhood school? So that means we're not including in this doesn't represent any students who are in an immersion program, but it does represent the students who are neighborhood students within a co-located immersion school. Those are the students who are going to be represented by the orange bars. While the students who go to a traditional neighborhood school are represented by the gray bars. Well, and this goes back to that first slide. What we see here is for that first bucket, 0 to 19%, it's the lowest rate of direct certification, or the lowest rate of free meals. We see that the students at co-located schools perform on par, if not better, than their neighborhood peers, meaning peers at a neighborhood school. But as we go through and we go into the higher buckets of direct certification rates, meaning our lower socioeconomic schools, we see that there's a disparity in performance of the neighborhood students at the co-located school versus neighborhood students at a traditional neighborhood school. And I also want to point out, again, this is just reflecting the K-5 Chinese and Spanish schools that are represented by the orange bars.
Yeah, there's a question from Harmony. I think you may have spoken to this, but this is the sum of all students in the programs, right? Are these trends consistent by school? So I think you said this specifically excludes immersion students, and it's just neighborhood students in those schools.
That's right. So we've aggregated across all the students who attend a Chinese or Spanish co-located school, all the neighborhood students who attend a Chinese or Spanish immersion school. For those 3 years we talked about, 16, 17, 18.
Yeah. And Suzanne, is this?
Can I clarify my question a little?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm curious. I just am curious. So I understand this is the aggregate of all of the students, like in the programs. I'm curious if this trend holds true, like looking at individual schools. And I know we're not going to necessarily look at that data because the N values might be too small. I'm just curious in terms of, like, for example, like the SES differential between neighborhood and immersion is different, like at Atkinson versus Bridger, right? Like it's switched. So I'm just curious, like, if the trends are consistent by school, like, do they all, like, is this true at Atkinson? Is this true at Bridger? Is this true? Like, I understand the aggregate, but I'm curious, like, by school, because I know each program is different, right? Like,
yeah,
2 strands versus 1 strand, right? Like, there's differences at each school.
Yeah, so we would definitely wouldn't, to your point, we definitely wouldn't surface this at a school level, given that this is accounting for and controlling for direct certification status. But this is a trend that we see consistent across the way that we might bucket it by direct certification. So it is a consistent theme, I'll say that. And we consistently see that the schools that are lower direct certification, comparable scores, if not better, for the students who are at co-located schools. I think somebody asked too if the percentages across the top are the direct certification, and they are, yeah. So the first column is 0 to 19% of students are direct certification, et cetera.
Yeah. And the other question or point was that this reinforces one of the summary statements that higher SES schools see less disparity between neighborhood DLI than lower SES schools.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. I think you've got one more slide, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, and then so the data that it's reflected on this slide is the same on the prior slide, except now we're just de-aggregating the data or bucketing it in a different way. So instead of bucketing it by direct certification rates, in this case, we're bucketing it by our students who are underserved student population versus those who are not in our underserved student population. Underserved students include those identifying as one or more Black, Latino, Native American, or Pacific Islander. And again, like I said, it's the same data sets. We're looking at 3rd through 8th grade, and we're looking at 16, 17, 18 scores. Again, the orange bar represents the neighborhood students at a co-located school, whereas the gray bar represents neighborhood students at a neighborhood school. And so here we see both, again, we're not accounting for direct certification. We're looking across all students in this case. but we see the students at co-located schools who are historically underserved. We see the biggest disparity there, where we see the lowest when we compare them to their peers. We see that the students at co-located schools do not meet standards as frequently as those who are at neighborhood schools. And we see those students, right? If we look at that column, those are the students who are performing or meeting standards less. The least is the students who are underserved in the neighborhood strain at a co-located school.
Suzanne, and one more point of clarification. I believe we may have addressed this, but is the data you're representing inclusive of all schools in the district, or only those that were included on that first slide in the Southeast? The impact.
Great question. I'm not sure if the appendix made it into this. If it did, okay. So there is an appendix, I'm sure, that can be provided, and it shows the list of schools that were included and the years with which they were included in any of this data
no,
set.
It is.
Okay,
it is
great.
in there. So we still have 2 more slides. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is the appendix you were speaking about, right?
That's right. Yep. So these are the schools that were included in the analysis for anything to do with SBAC scores. So the co-located schools are listed on the left. The neighborhood schools are listed on the right. It's a little bit hard to see. But if anybody needs to do the drill down and can't do it, we can provide it after.
Okay.
Can I ask one clarifying? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Andy.
I was going to ask one clarifying question on, I mean, it can be either of those 2 most previous charts that we saw, just to make sure I'm interpreting correctly. Yeah, like that one. So is the right way to read this, if I'm a student in that underserved category, I essentially have underserved students are performing worse or are performing worse in the neighborhood strand of co-located schools than like the same underserved students in neighborhood schools. Like that's what you mean by controlling for this stuff, right?
That's right. Yeah, I would say, yep. And the same holds true for the previous slide. When we bucket or control for direct certification rate and just look at the schools who fall into that direct cert rate, and we compare neighborhood and co-located versus neighborhood, that's where we see the disparity.
Right. So we're looking at schools that are serving similar populations, but we're still seeing a difference among the same students. Okay, got it.
That's right. And that was really the goal here, was to try to compare as similar of student populations as we could find.
Okay. You want to go to 2 slides, Marnie, which I think is your SPED data.
We have one more hand.
Oh, Josh.
Yeah, my question's about, given this data, and we heard this from Dr. Proctor too, so it's very interesting. Is this not more a measure for curriculum and on-site staff to be able to address the students they're missing versus it being a boundary or placement concern? Like, does moving the kids going to make a difference? Or is it, that we say, hey, wow, this analysis has identified underserved kids that need more attention. And that's something that as a community happens versus moving them into a different area.
That is, Karina, you want me to address that?
Sure, Dr. O.
Okay, that is a very good question. And that's one of the advocacies we're making for whole school DLI, because when you have the students together in one environment, you're better able to provide the resources, the professional development, the supports that they need to thrive. The way it is right now, we have a lot of single classes where teachers do not have the opportunity to collaborate or plan with peers. And professional development is just not as robust because you only have either one teacher per grade level. So you have a limitation in what you can do. But if they're all concentrated in one area, if they're all in one school, all those supports will be provided and housed to enable teachers grow, students learn, and ultimately increase academic achievement.
So as a quick follow-up, sorry, I saw Beth raised her hand too, so I don't want to take any extra time. But is this kind of presentation to help sway our recommendation? Because I think it's also important to say, hey, educators are saying that this is what needs to happen. And we say, okay, now we take those options off because the directive is to go to whole school.
I would say I don't think the district's interest is to sway anything. What we are presenting is the data that was requested about the impact of co-location on neighborhood students, certified versus non-certified. So, certainly I think it is a question that is going to, I think the district has said, and that is why the first two proposals were focused on whole school models, right? But I think that is for you all to talk about, certainly in the two groups. So Josh, I do want to move on to Beth. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually a good follow-up to what Josh was saying, because first of all, I wanted to thank staff for this presentation. And I know that it's a common question that's come up for since the scenarios were first presented was, where's the data on supporting the whole school DLI model? And I know that within Portland Public, we just do not have data that shows where we can compare how DLI students are doing in a co-located compared to an all-school model. It just, because of the way our programs are configured, we can't look at that. We don't have that comparison there. And so I really appreciate staff's work to answer the questions with the data that we do have in the way that's the most relevant for some of the questions that we're asking. And this, I think, is really useful to be able to see an apples to apples. We're looking at neighborhood students where we can compare a co-located situation to an all neighborhood school situation, looking at and being able to control for different demographic groupings and things like that. So I just wanted to thank you for this work and say that this really gives us something to chew on and to think about, since it's harder to do direct comparisons for whole school versus co-located DLI.
And I just quickly want to reiterate what Karina said. The district is not trying to sway anybody's opinions either way. Our job is to respond to the questions that you have and to provide the information we have to enable the Southeast Guiding Coalition Committee make the best decision in the interest of all our students.
Yes, sure. I don't see any hands up. There is a question, Alyssa, and this is obviously not, I think, something you can, or from Alyssa, Suzanne, that I don't think you can answer on hand, but it looks like there's a request. Is it possible to get this same data just for schools in the Southeast? So that's, yes, not for tonight. Exactly. Maybe
I can give a response, I guess, just initially. Okay. I think I'm probably going to drop off here now. And so, Judy, you can relate to me or we can hash things out. We would just have to hone in, I think, what data we would want to see, because some of it's not relevant, I guess, to a neighborhood school. So, yeah, I guess as the dialogue continues, if we kind of finalize what follow-ups we want from a data perspective, Judy or Dr. O can relay those back to me.
Okay, Suzanne, I think there is one more slide that you had, which was about SPED.
Right. And then... So yeah, we put that in the appendix because that was another thing, just for the very first thing, to bring us back to the beginning, right? We said we were going to look at things from a performance standpoint as well as a need versus allocation. Direct certification is one of those avenues to look at need versus allocation, as is special education rates. And with the special ed, we did the same look, but we didn't see anything that was consistent across school or across years where we consistently saw some disparity between the neighborhood versus the whole school within co-located of special education rates.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Suzanne. And then yeah, I think that we're just trying to get some clarification from the group around same reports, but filtered only for Southeast schools. I think that's what we heard, Judy, but if Alyssa, if you were thinking something different, let us know. Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Okay. Next slide. It looks like there's one more question, and I don't know, this is probably a question for instructional leadership or Claire. This information obviously was really helpful, but trying to understand why there was a focus exclusively on elementary school and not on middle school, and then whether or not the data is transferable or consistent.
I think the time constraints is what I heard Suzanne say was why she hadn't gone in more extensive and trying to get some data to us for this meeting. And because, and then, so is this data transferable? I don't, we wouldn't know if it's transferable without looking.
The other piece I wanted to add to that, Claire, too, is that the schools that we're dealing with in Southeast Guiding Coalition are largely K-8, K-5 schools. I think we have Lane Middle School. And in terms of Lane Middle School, we looked at Spanish and we looked at Mandarin Chinese in the data. Neither one applies to Lane.
Okay, thank you, Dr. O. Thank you, Claire. Okay, so what we wanted to do is break up back into our small breakouts and talk with the folks in our program task forces, right? To talk about, our goal is to spend 20 minutes talking about kind of what we'll report out in terms of, what we heard, obviously trying to figure out if there's an impact to the data on the conversations within the group. We will come back together after this to kind of report out where each group stands in terms of their program recommendation for program placement recommendation, and what you had consensus around, where there were barriers, and any sort of outstanding questions. And so that is our goal today for our small groups. Any questions about that in terms of what we want to accomplish in our small groups? Okay, so let's go ahead and head to our small groups, and Marnie.
Nathan.
Oh, Nathan will push us to our small groups. Elisa and Marnie, don't forget to record. We're still waiting for the group to join us. Welcome back, welcome back. Okay, looks like we've got a majority of folks not really back yet. Give them one more minute. There we go. Welcome back. Special shout out to my Clackamas folks who took a little bit of a shorter break, but got to a good place. Okay. Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to do, and I don't think, Marnie, we necessarily need the presentation right now, because what we want to be able to do is share back to the larger group, report out from each of the smaller groups to kind of hear where you all landed in terms of your recommendation for program placement. So I'm actually going to start with, why don't we start with Chinese DLI?
Okay, let's see. Should we share your board? That was me.
Yeah, who is your folks? Because what we'd like to do is have your program placement representative talk about the recommendation.
Eddie, I know you were.
Yeah, I think that's Eddie.
Yeah,
I think that's me.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Eddie. We'll spotlight him, Arnie.
Hey, spotlight.
Hey, Eddie.
Great. Yeah, I'll just go really quick. So items of consensus, things that we kind of were working towards or mostly agreed upon. We were thinking about that the current MIP locations would stay co-located where they currently are, as in like proposal C. And then kind of the biggest, and this is all assuming that, we had to place a pin on where CSS was going to be, and we just kind of assumed that it was going to be placed at Bridger because it seemed like that was where it was heading. And then most of our discussion was talking about the other item of consensus was preferring to consolidate DLI at the middle school level. And the reason for this is because of more robust programming, staffing, professional development, student scheduling, et cetera. But the big kind of barrier that we encountered was transportation. The two MIP programs located at Woodstock and Harrison Park are kind of pretty distant from each other. So places that we needed more work on we were looking at each middle school as a possible MIP hub, and a lot of them had issues. So this is where we needed the most work. Hosford, which is the current one that Woodstock feeds into, would not be able to fit Harrison Park's strand of Mandarin immersion program. Then we talked about possibly Lane, but the issue we had there was that Lane is already host to the Russian DLI program, and it would just be huge issue with two DLI programs. And then we also talked a lot about possible loss of Title I status as a issue as well if moving all the Mandarin DLI there. And then so that kind of narrowed it down to kind of Harrison Park and Kellogg. So Harrison Park also had some issues. The Spanish DLI strand that is currently located there, according to proposal C, if we're using that as a pin, would, if we want to do a single DLI, one DLI per middle school, then we would have to talk with Spanish group, or that strand would have to probably be placed somewhere else. And then the other issue is that it would be a transportation hurdle for the Woodstock families. The other option was Kellogg, and that kind of came up at the end a little bit. Kellogg seemed like it kind of piqued our interest a little bit because it would be more accessible for, it's kind of almost a middle point between the Woodstock and Harrison Park families. But the Spanish DLI is currently, or hub there according to the current proposal. So that would be kind of a big issue, or, we talked a little bit about maybe possibly Spanish DLI moving to Harrison Park, which was an idea that was thrown out there. And then finally, what else? Oh yeah. So I think part of the things that we need from PPS is kind of to make a final decision on where Creative Science School should be located, or is going to be located. That kind of changes everything. And then also, I mentioned this before, but also it's time to work with the Spanish DLI group, because there's a lot of things that, if we're talking about program where they're located, we need some time to collaborate. And then finally, transportation was kind of like a huge thing that kept coming up, both in, what PPS, if PPS has plans for, if we are doing consolidating DLI, that would be something that would have to be communicated and worked out with families. And then some other things kind of came up at the end in terms of talking about, looking at the data that was presented today about neighborhood, how does that go into consideration about where we're placed? And I know a lot of the data we looked at wasn't specifically focused on middle schools. So I think that would be another item of discussion that I think we would like to talk about a little bit more too. I think that's it. I don't know if anybody else in my group wanted to add something. I know I forgot a few things. But yeah, if anybody else has anything to contribute.
Okay. Thank you, Eddie. All right, Harmony. You join me and talk about where the Spanish DLI group? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. The Spanish DLI group had trouble coming to full, robust 5 out of 5 recommendation, but we did come to some consensus around 3 different areas. One, we're interested in looking at another alternative for co-location because Atkinson doesn't appear to have capacity without some significant changes, considering Arleta as a co-located location for Spanish DLI. So it would be Arleta and Lane, but with some caveats that we could ensure a robust neighborhood, like right-sized neighborhood schools at all the surrounding schools. So Atkinson, even thinking Marysville, Creston, what the boundaries would change at Arleta. So all the downstream effects of that. But we are interested in seeing that scenario kind of drawn out and played out. We did come to pretty robust consensus around the desire for consolidated DLI at middle school. And a lot of, ideally that would be at Kellogg because the program has been established there and work has been done to create a full robust amount of wraparound services. So bilingual support staff, bilingual specialists, things like that, in addition to just the teachers being there. So that's an ideal, but obviously lots of downstream effects for Chinese DLI. And so definitely more conversations to be had. And then kind of the third area of conversation that we've been grappling with is the idea of whole school dual language immersion. And we can't seem to come to a conclusion amongst all of us. I think the different schools are experiencing different things in terms of co-location. We were appreciative to see the data today, but also not only the data, but considering community feedback onto that proposal, and still keeping in mind concerns about segregation, isolation, safety that have been brought up by our Latinx, especially native Spanish speaking families. So still, I think, struggling with that concept in terms of the real lived experiences at different schools, and that maybe there isn't a one size fits all. So I think in some, looking at Arleta as a second co-located space and trying to consolidate DLI at the middle school level.
Anyone else from the Clackamas room have any other thoughts to share? Thank you, Harmony. Okay.
I'm sorry if I missed it, but Harmony, did you go over the caveats?
Oh, Ron, you're on mute.
Places every time. That we want. So looking at Arleta as co-location, but also like what the downstream, we need to see the downstream effects. We've on a 1 up to 5, it was right around a 3. Everybody thinks, well, we'll look at that as an option. But what if that means that neighborhood schools aren't, right-sized around it? What if that means the boundaries for Arleta are changed in a way that doesn't make sense for that community? And then I think the other big component is how would you split Atkinson and Bridger's strands to go to Arleta or Lent, and what that plan would actually look like? Is it Bridger community stays together and moves to Arleta, and Atkinson moves to Lent? Is it a more robust data analysis of geography and siblings and all of those components, or is it a move of certain grade levels, to start, and then a build of the program? I think there's a lot of caveats to hence the 3 out of 5. We'd like to see that as the next option, but just as with whole school DLI models, we're just not there yet. We haven't found a solution that feels right for for all of the communities involved. Thanks, Sandra, for reminding me.
Yes, Harmony. And I think the other piece that you talked about, you had kind of all reached consensus around, similar to the Mandarin immersion program, was that CSS would move to Bridger. Is that correct?
I mean, I think we haven't talked that much about it. We've made an assumption because that's what we're hearing from the CSS work group. But I think, again, there are downstream effects for all, right? Like, we can only work in isolation in these separate groups so much, right? Like, that Bridger might be a great location, but what if that doesn't make sense based on all of the other program moves? Well, not back to the drawing board, but so I think we've made an assumption about Bridger at CSS, but I think that falls under our long list of caveats.
Right. I think it's safe to say, though, Harmony, that we made the assumption it's not at Arleta because we're proposing the DLI at Arleta.
Correct.
Yeah, that's true.
So split DLI between Arleta and Lent at elementary, and consolidation at the middle school with a preference for Kellogg. Is that right? With all the caveats. Okay. Last but certainly not least, I believe, Marnie, your group is led by Andy. Is that correct? Yeah. So Andy, will you talk to us a little bit about DLI or about CSS? Well, you talked to us about DLI as well, Andy, you know, because I know how much you love it. So no, will you give us the report out from CSS?
Yeah, and I think I can share my screen. We kind of wrote this up in a doc. Let me make sure I've got the right window open here.
I can share it for you too if you'd like.
Please, got
it. I think I got it. I don't know why everyone thought we'd recommend it. No, I'm just kidding. So we do in fact actually have, I think, a pretty solid consensus on this one piece, at least within our group. I think when we revisited it a few minutes ago, we were all 4s and 5s on the proposition that CSS would relocate to Creative Science would relocate to Bridger as a K-8 school. And you can see here some of the factors that we considered in sort of comparing Bridger to the idea of locating at Arleta or Woodstock. I think it was important that there was less disruption to the neighborhood community. When you look at the Bridger boundary, even in this proposal, compared to locating Creative Science at Woodstock or Arleta, so it maintains a lot of Bridger's current boundary. The location it's relatively close to the current Creative Science location, which is a plus. There's sort of a programmatic justification for the change at Bridger anyway, since we've talked about the importance of not having single strand neighborhood programs, which Bridger currently has. So there's going to need to be some sort of change to the neighborhood program at Bridger anyway. The Bridger neighborhood community in Convert. So I'm a Bridger parent. For those of you who don't know, I would say that the Bridger neighborhood community has been relatively receptive to this idea, especially again, when you compare some of the feedback that we've heard from Arleta and Woodstock about the idea of Creative Science locating there. That was a plus. And then obviously maintaining Creative Science as a K-8 would maintain it as the small middle school option in Outer Southeast, which is important to the district. And I'd say in addition to there being consensus on these positives for Bridger, I think there was consensus, or there's like anti-consensus on the other two. So not only is Bridger the one that we had consensus on, there wasn't a feeling that locating it at Arleta or Woodstock as a K-8 was even viable. So I'd say that's sort of what we had consensus on. In terms of questions or concerns, I don't think there's any like blockers here. We talked a lot about the implications for the use of the portables at Bridger. I think in a perfect world, there's a desire to not have to rely on the portables long term. But the portables would still need to be used in what we're recommending. But I think there's a desire, and what I'm hearing from PPS is that there's optimism that that the community could find a way to use the portables such that it's not like any student's all-day experience, like not necessarily used for core classes, but like being able to work that through and make that happen. I know is something that would be important to the Bridger community, but I think just the entire small group found some consensus on that point. That's not something we can work out in advance, but it's something that we'd hope that the administration would prioritize. We talked a lot about the need to, if the group agrees, if the larger group agrees on this, to facilitate some community building, like early between Bridger and creative science, to sort of bring the communities together to think about how this would work, and not just build community for community's sake, but also think through any sort of questions about portables or anything else, and that would be great if PPS could help facilitate that. We also, this is obviously something for the district or the board to decide. We kind of noted that under this proposal, we've heard a lot in this process about the challenges that single strand neighborhood programs face. Because we're delaying implementation by another year, Bridger's neighborhood program is going to remain a single strand with all the challenges that entails for another year than was planned. And we were sort of wondering whether it's possible, in the same way that I think we discussed giving Harrison Park's middle school program some extra support next year, because of the delay, if there's something that could be done to support Bridger's neighborhood program in the same way next year. So we discussed that. Similar concerns about whether there's any sort of this state of flux could affect enrollment and staffing at creative science, and whether there's anything that could be done to maintain stability, ensure we're maintaining stability in creative science next year as well. I think that's it. What did I miss, other folks in the group? So, I think we saw all of those as potentially solvable issues or answerable questions, but I'd say we have really strong consensus on the top line about Bridger is the best option here.
Thanks, Andy. Anyone else? I'll invite you to stop sharing, Andy. Thank you. All right. Anyone else? Any questions? So one of the things that we want to do now is move to, we've created polls just on the fly here based on the recommendations that we heard, and we want to get to a point where we're polling all of the SCGC members and the principal representatives on, again, fist to 5, kind of where do you land on each of the program placements. But just want to be sure that there aren't any questions about any of the particular proposals before we move on to that. Okay, doesn't sound like it. All right, Nathan, will you put us into the poll? Will you start with whatever poll you've drawn up first? Okay, so again, hoping to get feedback from SCGC members and teacher representative or principal representatives. Okay, I think we're probably at capacity. Okay, all right, we're sharing results. It looks like we've got pretty good consensus around mostly between 3s and 4s, or 3s, yeah, between 4 and 5. So pretty good consensus around the placement for CSS. Okay. Will you do the same for our next poll, Nathan? Okay, again, I think we've reached critical mass. But this one's a little bit more spread out, but looks like we've got 50% or I'm going to say 65% in the 4s and 5s with an additional 23% in 3 and about 4 people in the 1s and 2s. So at least that's a good starting point for discussion, which is what we'll do next. But if we will finish us off with the Spanish DLI poll, and we can kind of go from there. Okay, getting there. Go ahead and close it, Nathan, and share. So this one looks like, again, we're at, what would that be? That would be almost 80% between 3 and 4, 90% if we go from 3 to 5 with 10% in the 2. So again, pretty good consolidation. Okay, so what we want to do now is just kind of invite folks. We want to try and figure out, especially for those of you that were not in the 3 to 5 range for any of the schemes, what would it take to get you to move from where you are to at least a position of I can support this, which is where we are at 3. Because what we want to now be able to do is we were going to go back into small groups, but it seems as though we need to spend some time talking about middle school placement between some of the groups. So we might stay and have conversation in this group. So, but first off, for those of you that are struggling with any of these plans, is there a question? Is there something that would get you? What would be the driver of support for you? You can raise your hand or put a note in the chat. I'm not seeing anyone kind of really coming up with any major drivers for success. So I think we need to just see some options modeled out. Fair enough, Andy. Kind of given those directions. So why don't we pivot a little bit in terms of what our original plan was and just kind of stay in this group and talk a little bit maybe between the Chinese DLI program group and the Spanish DLI program group around kind of the middle school placement of those groups, right? So maybe, I don't know, I'm going to pick one to start. I know Spanish DLI was a little bit stronger in their recommendation in terms of why they wanted to stay at Kellogg. And so maybe we'll start with folks in that group talking about why that was your preferred location for Spanish DLI at the middle school level in a consolidation. And maybe Marnie, remove spotlight and just let's be in gallery here for a while so people can hear each other.
It might stay in spotlight for you. In the upper right-hand corner of Zoom, you can go change your view and see.
You should be able to see everyone. Okay, I'm going to invite you all to raise your hand. Anyone from Spanish? Oh, Beth, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in before the Spanish group talked, but I just wanted to say that with the polls, I feel like I would have had an easier time answering if the individual elements were broken out. Like for the Spanish group, it said co-locating at Arleta and Lent and middle school consolidation in one location. And I might feel one way about one of those things and another way about the other one. So I don't know. I don't know if that's asking too much to redo those polls, but I feel like we may get clearer data if we look at each thing individually, because they
just as it relates to the Spanish DLI group.
Well, I think it was the same thing for the Chinese group too. There was the piece about co-locating at Woodstock and Clark, and there was the piece about consolidating at middle school. So, people might feel different ways about those individual pieces.
So I don't believe, the location of the co-location of the consolidation is the point that's at issue here, right? So not necessarily whether they are consolidated at the middle school, it's just what program lands where.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and you're right. That's a different question.
Yeah. So I think that's what we want to talk about before we get to another poll is what program should land where at the middle school level. So I don't know, Harmony, I don't mean to keep putting you on the spot. Anyone else from Clackamas Group or Spanish DLI want to talk about the desire, and I don't know, the desire to kind of keep Spanish DLI matriculating to Kellogg? What I'm hearing Dee say.
I can start the
go ahead,
I can start the conversation. I think part of the reason we want consolidation, period, right, and part of the arguments for whole school DLI or fewer programs is that they can be staffed in a way that it's not just bilingual teachers, but there is a bilingual administration and a bilingual counselor and bilingual elective teachers. And at Kellogg's, that's already kind of been constructed, right? Like there was significant investment and work done to make that happen, to have kind of all of those other pieces in place. And I think there's an assumption that, it's one thing to move bilingual teachers as a program, but to move wholesale, like essentially you'd have to like pick up the Kellogg staff, put them at Harrison Park, and then rebuild for a different program at Kellogg. And I think there's a real desire to like not lose that investment and the momentum that they are starting to build this year.
Thank you, Harmony. Dee, got your hand up?
I think at least for the Bridger neighborhood, part of the desire to stay at Kellogg, most of our families have kids in both programs, K-5 and the middle school. And, we're a predominantly working class program. And so a lot of kids at the middle school level are getting themselves to school by themselves, and they're also picking up siblings and facilitating before and after care. And so the location of the middle school felt really important because kids are going there independently, and it felt more central and more accessible to sort of where we're drawing from right now anyway. And then the ability to facilitate sort of after school and safety and pickups and all that stuff. And there's a lot of community support within the community about getting kids where they need to be when they need to be there. And so trying to keep the community together was pretty important to everybody as well. The actual location was less important as just trying to keep it cohesive.
Okay. Yeah. Sandra.
Just to add to what Harmony said, because I think it's important to mention that we had Jennifer, is it Fontaine? Is that her last name? Fontana. Sorry, my apologies. Come and speak to us last night, because there was sort of a sentiment and even a statement like, okay, well, Kellogg's been open 1 year. They just started this program. It doesn't seem like it would be any more harm to move that middle school program and consolidate it elsewhere. And then from an administrator perspective, she was saying that the amount of work and time that went into setting up that program at Kellogg, essentially, it would be nearly impossible to duplicate at this time because it goes so far beyond the teachers. It's like the front office staff is bilingual. The administration, has been specially chosen. The counselors have been specially chosen. So from the ground up, it's been tailored to having that DLI Spanish experience at the middle school level at Kellogg at this time.
Thank you. I'm seeing some chatter about kind of the impacts of these decisions on our stated goal of increasing enrollment at Harrison Park and Lane. And so I'm gonna probably then I'm doing this on the fly. Before we get to continuing the discussion, no, you know what? I'm changing my mind. Go ahead, Eddie, and then you, Eddie.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was raised in our group was, especially about Lane, the goal of increasing enrollment. And when we were talking about putting a focus on the neighborhood side of the program, and I guess one of the kind of hesitancies of moving the Mandarin program to, for example, Lane, was to boot as in an effort to boost enrollment there. There was some worry about how that would affect the neighborhood program. And then I think there was some wanting to try to grow Lane's enrollment kind of more naturally through boundary expansion instead. And so that was one of the concerns or one of the ideas that was kind of raised in our group. Thanks.
Thanks, Eddie. Andy.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to amplify what I guess Christy and Marissa raised in the chat, which is, I think, if my memory is correct about the scenarios we've seen already, if consolidating, maintaining the Spanish at Kellogg and also consolidating all the strands there, makes it that much harder to get enough enrollment at Harrison Park. And so I think it just goes to the point of needing to see how some of these things look when we model them out, right?
Yeah. Philip, I'm going to go to you, and then I'll have Jed, because I know that Jed's prepared to kind of speak to that point and those questions here. But I'm going to, you had your hand up, Philip. We'll go to you, and then we'll go to Jed.
Thanks so much. I was just thinking about, or curious about, the data that we saw at the top of the meeting and how it really makes a strong case for the impact a move of pushing in DLI into a school like Arleta would have on BIPOC students. And just wanted to bring to the table the idea of our PPS reimagined and the vision of our district and how that would impact students seeing that data. So I'm curious why we're not still talking about a whole school model if we know that is better for programming and better for students.
Anyone, I know in the Spanish immersion group, we had that conversation. I don't know if that was also true in the Chinese immersion group. But anyone from those groups want to speak to that?
Well, in the Mandarin group, we didn't have a chance to discuss it, but it did come up right at the end that, we had sort of had this discussion, earlier in the week, had some consensus around co-located K-5, and then the data that was presented. Do we need to have another discussion and sort of think about it in light of this new data that came out? We haven't actually had that conversation yet.
Anyone from Spanish DLI group? Chris, I see you. And then I'll go to you, Harmony.
So we did talk about that, the whole group in our breakout. And I think there probably were two reasons it didn't go any further. One is it's just so hard. It's just so hard to imagine how to make it work. And the other thing is, I think there's I think parents have a lot of different feelings. We have some feelings based on our own experiences and on looking at the data. One of the things I heard a number of times in our group was people worried about being all in one school would make them feel segregated. When I worked at Richmond, I heard the exact opposite from families there who, although may not have been predominantly Japanese, were very high percentage Asian. And they felt, particularly during the last several years of a lot of anti-Asian things going on, they felt protected and cared for and valued in that setting. So those were two conflicting things that prevented us from getting much further with it.
Okay. Harmony?
I think, frankly, we haven't thought very deeply about the population at Arleta. I think we looked at the size of Arleta as a force potential to hold 4 strands. It was in conversation around creative science, so we knew that. I think there needs to be conversation around, especially given the population of historically underserved at Arleta, by moving to a co-located space that does have impacts downstream that I will say, frankly, I don't feel like our group has considered deeply. So I appreciate that point being raised, and yeah, adding more depth to this conversation.
Thank you, Harmony. Eddie.
Yeah, I just want to point out, this conversation about whole school DLI is something that's keeps getting raised, and we keep talking about it. But yeah, looking at the data earlier, I just had some issues with the data, and we're talking about, I really didn't have a chance to talk about it. But one of the things I want to also throw a warning out there is that, the data was looking at the difference between the neighborhood components and the students in the immersion programs. And it wasn't comparing co-located versus whole school DLI. And it'd be, we need to be careful about how we read that data. Like, for example, from what I got from that data was that it looks like some schools are better choices for hosting co-location than others. And that definitely is for sure. There are some schools that just are not a good fit for DLI. And also the numbers were a little weird. If you look at I can't remember exactly, the 0 to 29% direct certification, the neighborhood students grossly outnumbered the number of immersion students. And on the other end of the spectrum, the 60 plus, the immersion students grossly outnumbered the, there's definitely something wonky. I feel like we have to be kind of careful about what that suggests. And right now, what I see it suggests is that some schools just are not good fits for a DLI program. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. O.
I just wanted to weigh in on what Eddie said. Eddie, thank you so much for your comment. And you are correct. Some schools are not great environments for the DLI program. However, that said, we also asked for additional data. For example, we wanted to track the students a cohort of kids who started at the elementary and then matriculated through all the grade levels to sort of measure for the attrition rate on the DLI side, plus the stability on the neighborhood side. But we didn't have enough time to call all of that. But Suzanne is going to work on it for us, because that would also help us to see what happens to kids over time in the DLI program. One of the other pieces of data that we saw, but couldn't really work on it well enough for it to fit the presentation for tonight, because there was so much more work that we needed to do, is the fact that we noticed that in 8th grade, for example, at one of the slides, the kids actually were performing a whole lot better, the kids who were in the DLI program. So then the question becomes, is it because the kids who were less successful left and went into the neighborhood program, or are these the same kids who started from kinder? So there are all those pieces of information that we wanted. We just had such a time constraint that, what we presented tonight, but we're working behind the scenes to get all that additional information out.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Anyone else? Maybe someone we haven't heard from tonight that wants to chime into this whole school versus co-located model. Raise your hand. Josh.
Thank you. I wanted to kind of revise. I brought up early on, I used the word sway, which kind of turned everybody around. But I do firmly believe that the district is, experts in this space can say, this is the direction we need to go, now work around it, versus having the coalition say, this is what we've all decided on based on, feedback. Progress doesn't work very far if we're always looking backwards for the future. So,
yeah. Before we get to you, Beth, I want to allow an opportunity to get to Jed to kind of have him do a little bit of ground setting for us in terms of the impacts of the things that we've talked about. And then I'll go to you right after that. Thanks, Beth.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. So following the Spanish DLI focus group conversation last night, we started to pull some of these threads with draft proposal C as sort of the baseline. So I just want to point out some of the highlights from that, with, the first big piece being Arleta co-located with 2 strands of Spanish DLI. And so from a capacity standpoint, looking at the 2025 projection, we're in the 72% utilization range. Again, this Arleta has more classrooms than most schools in the region at the K-5 level. So makes sense that that works with the boundary that has been drawn in draft proposal C, right? So that's a little bit more squared off than we see with Arleta's current boundary. So from a strict utilization standpoint, that has us under the 80% benchmark that we've been looking at for that 2025 planning horizon. Another thing that we, if we're moving from Spanish DLI co-located at Atkinson to Arleta, that we then need to look at, I think a problem that we saw in draft proposal C was the under enrollment of Mount Tabor. And so with Atkinson now being neighborhood only, we're then able to put Atkinson back to feeding Mount Tabor. Now, recall that in draft proposal C, Atkinson had been flipped to start feeding the Kellogg due to that, due to not wanting to have a split feeder between the neighborhood program and the co-located Spanish DLI. So ultimately that helps out the Mount Tabor enrollment. But what we do see, and I know that this has been of concern, is a pretty low enrollment with Atkinson as is, or with a pretty close boundary to what it has for draft proposal C. And so one way that we could address that, however, is that if it is in a feeder with Glencoe is a school that is in the mid 300 enrollment. So there could be some exchange between those 2 attendance areas to help bring both of those closer to the 270 mark and have those more evenly distributed. So that could be addressed. Let's see what else was noted. In draft proposal C, Kellogg is actually within the Atkinson attendance area. So there was a small change that was that we looked at making to have that within the Marysville attendance area. So now Marysville would be going across Powell. I don't know that that's something that we want to see, but that's just a reality of where Kellogg is located. And if we're going to ensure that it's within its attendance area, that's something that we'll have to pay attention to. So, back to Harrison Park and Lane. Just starting with Lane is the more simple example here. What we had done in draft proposal C was adding Lewis to that feeder pattern to bolster its enrollment, and was able to get Lane up to about 570 students with that move. So I know that we've talked about maybe there's some balancing between Selwood and Lane that could happen to get them a little bit more even. So that's the situation with Lane in draft proposal C, and we didn't need to pull that thread at all based on what we're hearing around the Spanish DLI piece. But what we are now focused on is Harrison Park, right? And with creative science cited at Bridger, and it being a K-8 program, we've essentially pulled out one of the nearby schools that could feed to Harrison Park and has fed to Harrison Park in draft proposals A and B, leaving us with a question: how do we fill that gap? And so the things that we've looked at are Lent with a co-located Spanish program being there, and that's what we see right now in draft proposal C. We also have talked about Chinese DLI consolidated there for all of Southeast. And I think another possibility is Atkinson feeding there as a neighborhood program. But we did look at that, and that would produce a boundary peculiarity in that you'd actually be hopping over the Bridger attendance area to bring in Atkinson. So those are just some of the things that are out there in play for Harrison Park. But if we're to get one of those schools or the Chinese DLI program in place, that does get us above the 500 enrollment target for Harrison Park.
Okay, so I think, and we'll go to you here in a second, Beth, but I think one of the things that we need to wrestle with tonight as an SCGC is how do we want in this next iteration flow to kind of build for robust enrollment at Harrison Park, right? That's going to be kind of the key question here. Beth, sorry, you've had your hand up for a while. Nope, you're still on mute. There you go.
My cursor was
frantically pushing buttons. Yeah.
Okay, so this was related to the whole school DLI question, and one of the things that's come up in my mind that I just want some clarity on is we've talked. One of the concerns I've had about whole school DLI is an all lottery program that then reduces access to a nearby neighborhood school for surrounding neighborhood students, particularly in high poverty areas. And I'm wondering what the potential is for sort of a hybrid model, kind of like what we're proposing for Bridger and CSS, where there is a neighborhood catchment and then also a lottery component. And that's something I don't think that we've seen proposed for a whole school DLI. So I just wanted to put that out there as for me, that mitigates one of my concerns about losing access to a neighborhood school by creating an all school lottery DLI. I know that's not the only concern, but that's just one.
Thanks, Beth. Okay, so I want to center us back on this question of what do you as SCGC members, like what should be the drivers for building robust enrollment at Harrison Park? I want us to have a conversation about that, because ultimately in whatever model that we want Flow to do, we need to kind of give them some direction.
I just say something in the chat. I think it partly hinges on I think we've heard a pretty compelling case that we'd like it would be ideal to maintain what's been started at Kellogg with Spanish. I think a question, probably a threshold thing, is like, is that a must-have for us, or is that we'd like it, but we'd still want to see what it looks like at Harrison Park? I don't know if we have consensus on that either way.
Yeah, and then trying to figure out, right, if, and maybe Jed, this is where you can come back, right? If that is the consensus that that Spanish moves to Kellogg in a consolidated model at the middle school, then what are the options for building up the enrollment at Harrison Park. And one of those could be Mandarin, right? If you move the Mandarin Consolidated Middle School program to Harrison Park, then are we solving the enrollment issues?
That is one of the options that you would have. The other one that I talked about is Atkinson, right? But that presents kind of that weird boundary, discontiguous boundary that we talked about. The other piece here is that in draft proposal C, Lent is feeding to Harrison Park with its Spanish DLI program. So if there were a split feeder at that school where the Spanish DLI went on to Kellogg and the neighborhood program went on to Harrison Park, you'd be around that 500 mark as well. But I know that that's something that we've been trying to avoid in most situations.
Can I just clarify, Jed? So is Harrison Park where the feeders are Vestal, Harrison Park itself, and all of Mandarin Emergent? Is that enough?
Clark, Vestal, and Olive Chinese DLI, yes.
Oh, okay. I don't think I was clear on that. That's
how many is that about?
And Lent or Atkinson, right?
Well, that was my question. Does it need? Yeah.
No, you don't.
Are we going back to option A? This was modeled in option A. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
If you dig out just off the middle school part of option A.
I think that sounds like possibly very promising.
Except for the clearly articulated concerns about distance, transportation, geography that emerged from that group. So,
and that may be something that we can have Lisa chime in on in terms of the transportation impacts of that. Alyssa, you got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I am wondering, Jed, what you back like a few statements about splitting strands and co-located schools. So I think I'm wondering, are we for that at the middle school level? So like if we maintain co-located DLI programs, do we as a group care if some of those programs get split between neighborhood goes one place at middle school and DLI goes another place? Or are we saying that like one of the values here should be to like keep that community together? Like if they were together in elementary, then we're going to move them all to the middle school. And will it look different? So like at one place, it might be there's a split, and at another place, it would be that they go together. Because you mentioned it for Lent, but I didn't, because I'm a Woodstock neighborhood parent, so I didn't hear you. If we take Mandarin DLI to Harrison Park, for the numbers, do you need all the neighborhood kids to go there too? Or like where would the neighborhood kids go? So that's my only clarifying question around what to do with like maintaining co-location at the middle school level.
Alyssa, that is a great clarification, and you're right on that. If all of Chinese DLI is consolidated at Harrison Park, you would then have a split feeder there between the neighborhood program and the Chinese DLI program. Yes.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to maybe invite that conversation, right? That you started, Alyssa. Where are we on split feeders, right? Is the important thing, which I think is what I've heard, that the DLI strands consolidate, or is it more important that the neighborhood and DLI strands move to matriculate to the same middle school? Now let's talk about that. Chris.
Could someone with a DLI experience tell me, in a split program, in a co-located program, how much do the kids in each strand get to know each other?
And maybe Carmen, because one of the questions is there a Lent rep? So this might be a good one if you have an opportunity to chime in here, Carmen.
they do get to work together in classrooms. So they do third grade work, so third grade, fourth grade in the neighborhood and in the immersion, but they also all have recess together. So they do get to know each other. I mean, our school isn't super big, but everybody gets to know everybody. I feel like there's not really a separation from like the immersion kids just hanging out with the immersion kids and the neighborhood side hanging out with the neighborhood side. So I would say that they all get to know each other. I could say, speaking for my son, who is a sixth grader at Kellogg, he doesn't just hang out with Lent kids anymore at Kellogg. So, he's made friends with Bridger kids. He's made friends with, he's made a lot of friends with Bridger immersion students, because they're not all just in, with Lent students. So they grew up going K through 5th with the same strand of kids. So I don't know if they were just tired of seeing each other all the time for 6 years straight. But yeah, I feel like it changes in middle school. They're not as connected from what I could see just from my experience as a parent. But I do think that during the K-5, I feel like they're more together. Also because of Sun School, there's opportunity for kids that aren't in immersion to participate in things in Spanish in Sun School. So they also get that opportunity to have a language experience there as well.
Okay. I'm going to try and move some of the conversation in the chat to the room. Dee, it looks like there were some questions around what you were posing. Maybe you talk a little bit about that, and then we can have a conversation around, kind of better understanding what the split feeder is we're trying to get to.
Andy, you please chime in here, but that's not been a Bridger. We do share recess and lunch, but there's just a difference between sort of like that incidental interaction and then like actual being in the classroom with kids. And so I don't know if it's our like two DLI, one neighborhood that is the difference from the other schools, but we don't have a lot of interaction between the two strands. Andy, would you disagree?
I think that's my experience has been. Yeah, I mean, I think they feel like separate programs operating in the same building, I guess would be my experience. Not totally separate, but yeah.
And we certainly share like cultural events, and the teachers definitely co-teach in teams, but having kids at elementary and middle school right now, I would agree with Carmen. In middle school, it seems to be sort of much more mixed, and in elementary school, it seems to be a little bit less mixed. So it feels like it would be less of a hardship to sort of say, okay, focus programs, part of what comes with choosing a focus program is you do have a different feeder than the base elementary school. That doesn't necessarily feel unfair to me than having a split feeder for a school where you're splitting it geographically for some reason.
Right, because you're already making the transition to middle school with a bunch of other kids anyway.
Right.
Phil, you had your hand, Philip, you had your hand up, and then you put it, you're good. Okay.
I was just to build on that too, Dee. I mean, it's I think part of this is it's unlikely we're going to find a scenario that ticks every one of the priorities you'd want to hit in a perfect world. And so part of this is going to involve sort of it's so even if we think that avoiding split feeders is ideal, is that more important than, for example, a scenario that otherwise hits all of the goals around enrollment at Harrison Park and Lane? And I mean, the reality is, I think changing cohorts at natural transition points, like between elementary and middle school, is just like a fact of life in large portions of this is not a crazy idea, right? It's so I think we should think carefully about whether we consider it a deal breaker.
Yeah, along those lines, I feel like some of the things that have been proposed wouldn't make geographic sense for the neighborhood and the DLI program to go to the same middle school without making that. Seems like geography should be more of a priority for neighborhood, whereas maybe that's not as top of list for DLI program necessarily. So it doesn't seem like it should be a deal breaker.
Anyone else want to speak to that? Yeah, Philip, now you're back. Yeah.
just wanted to speak quickly about from the office standpoint, it becomes really, can be very challenging when we have two programs. I was the summer principal at Bridger, so we hosted multiple schools, but it was really hard when we have two different programs and that language piece, because we are serving parents. And so the equity piece and being able to speak with parents and communicate with parents and get communications out from an office standpoint and from a central standpoint can be really challenging. And that can pose a staffing challenge to the district because they want to really make sure that we're supporting all students and families in a school. So that piece just is in my mind.
Okay. Anyone else? Michael, actually, I think you've got some direct firsthand experience from Lane that might be germane to this conversation.
Yeah, I don't know that I can say much more than I put in the chat, but since I've been at Lane now for 6 years, we've split just by address between two high schools. And I don't know that that's had an enormous negative impact on our community. In fact, I think in some cases it allows students to kind of branch out and join a new community as they move to high school. So I think it's had kind of a mixed effect and haven't seen it as a major liability.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My hand, sorry.
Go ahead.
I want to add to what was Michael was saying about splitting, because my son was technically supposed to go to Franklin, but he's at McDaniel. And as a parent, I'll speak, I was really worried and scared for him because he didn't have any friends that were going to his school at all. Like I'm going to admit I cried when I dropped him off because it's this fear as a parent, you know, to have them go and you want them to be safe, but it was dropping them off to the unknown, really. And when he came back, I was so surprised. He had already made friends. It was one day in, he had someone. So I think that just as parents, sometimes those are the thoughts that go through our mind. So I want to acknowledge, you know, what everyone else is saying when it comes to splitting them. I feel like it's harder with the younger kids, as it has been said. But I think like middle and high school, those are good lessons to be learned, even though we try to protect our kids from pain or from separation or from anything that has to do with that, with change. We see negative, but I feel like it's not as bad as we parents think that it may be, because I was one of those
parents. Thanks, Carmen. Sandra.
Just piggybacking on that, like I really think it depends on the child. I mean, in phase one, I had a conversation with Judy when we were talking about what was going to happen to the kids on transfer passes and going to Kellogg. And I was the only SEGC member that had a kid that was on a transfer pass at a school that fed to Kellogg. And depending on the kid, I mean, we can give anecdotal evidence all day, but I have 4 kids in my house and 2 of them are at our charter school, another one's at a focus option, and the other one's in our neighborhood program. And switching my little guy would be a huge problem, you know, and him being split from people, like even just having our principal out has caused problems in our household. So, I mean, it really depends on the student.
Yeah. Lisa.
Yes, that's exactly what it does. It depends on the children. And like I said, that's why I'm here. I'm youth advocating for them. And I have a couple of students at Arleta that have been talked about, you know, they had talked about it and they're scared. The younger kids are scared to get split up. And that's something we have to think about. Not only that too is when you're moving places to places, like the space, like I understand Arleta is a big school, but they don't have enough staff for a lot of stuff. And I mean, I understand this is bringing in staff, whatever, you know, but I think we still have to think about people's space and where we're moving everyone. And I have to agree, moving kids at a young age would be a big thing prior to moving the older kids. It's great experience, like Carmen said. So I work with all youth and I agree with that.
Thank you, Lisa. Just a reminder, thank you for joining us. Lisa's our student NIA rep, so it's always great to have that voice in the room. Okay, so I think there's been a lot talked about in the conversation tonight. I think we're slowly moving towards some consensus. Still some questions about kind of where we are from a modeling perspective. So Marnie, will you fire us up? Thank you. So just to kind of give you an idea of where we are in the trajectory of where we need to be to get to a board vote in the middle of March is we really were trying to, between now and the 20th, kind of nail down our program decisions so that way we can move into a boundary focus, right? And so we can talk a little bit about how we get from where we are today to how we get there, but that's kind of our next step. And then really kind of focus on the boundaries for those two meetings, the meeting 12 and meeting 13, before we took it back out to community and then reviewed community input to kind of get to a final recommendation through our FISTA 5 consensus process to take to the board in late February for them to vote on in mid-March. So with that, what that means is that we have to do a little bit more work together, right? Next, Marnie. And so what you'll see is we need to add a work session, or it would be good to add a work session to allow us to get to that place, right? We have some times proposed. So we're going to pull out a poll here, and this isn't a vote once. This is a let us know as of right now. And again, like we can work around times, but thinking about kind of this time frame for our Thursday meetings, and then Saturdays again we could work whether it's a morning or an afternoon, probably preferably a morning for most people to free up the day, but we can make that work. So vote for any option that works for you, right? So this is a multiple choice, and we want to know if we added a work session to allow us to get to consensus on any of these dates, which work for you. So we're going to give you a minute to pull up your calendars, and then Nathan is going to, well, he already has. Uh-oh.
Karina, are we missing some dates there?
Yeah, this does not. Can you end the poll and recreate it with these dates? Because those do not look like the same dates that are on.
And can I do a quick explanation for
Sure, Judy.
why we particularly, I know we're constantly upselling you, right? But one more meeting. Obviously, like I'm going to say, like personally, I think you guys made amazing progress on some very difficult issues and have had some deep, respectful conversation. And times are, if it's Thursday, it would be an evening meeting. If it's Saturday, I would say it's TBD, or late morning to midday is my guess. But clearly, it was becoming clear that we needed flow analytics to get to be able to do some work and give that work back to you before you could finalize even the program placements. You needed to see some impacts. And so obviously they couldn't do that just overnight. And one of our wonderings is, could we come back with you and see that next week? And if we could get that done next week, then you could launch into that next level, which is, okay, now let's make sure the neighborhood boundaries and feeder patterns are matched up and right. And you could get that work flowing if you could get a meeting in between now and the 20th. Otherwise, things are going to start to feel really stacked up afterwards. So that's my quick promo. Thank you.
Okay. And yeah, there was I think the dates changed between our planning meeting and this meeting. So we're kind of asking Nathan to do some work on the fly here. So Nathan, just let us know whenever you are ready. And to sort of reiterate what Judy said, because some of you are direct messaging me, evenings on the Thursday meetings and let's say mid-morning start time for the Saturday sessions. Yeah, Sheila, the flow will work as fast as they can and try and get this information out to you as quickly as possible. Okay, so now you should, I think those are the right dates. So again, vote for as many as you can make. Okay, getting there. We've got the majority of our SCGC members who have voted. So why don't we go ahead and end the poll. Okay, so it looks like our Thursdays work better for people than Saturdays. So we will take that. I think the district will take that. We also want to be sure we can get you information in time, right? So we'll work with Flo to figure out how quickly they can turn, because what I heard from Jed, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jed, that it isn't exactly the middle school matriculation that was modeled in option A. There are some other, it would be slightly different is what I think I heard you say. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So I don't know, Judy, can you think of anything else that we need to cover tonight? Does anyone else have any questions? Anything else that you need to be able to kind of bring us to closure?
Since you asked,
yeah,
thanks first of all, and this is pivoting back to Beth's comments and the polls that we took. If there are components of those K-5 recommendations that we straw polled on tonight that you have concerns about, you have ideas about, and you want to let people know about, will you please include that in your exit survey that you're going to take tonight? Since we didn't spend a lot of time on the K-5 parts. And then secondly, I believe that we'll let you know tomorrow, like you should look for at least one additional meeting, hopefully by tomorrow, so that you can make plans. And thanks for your flexibility.
Yeah, I think the other thing maybe to include in your exit interview is if you have any specific, or in discourse, is if you have any specific questions for our transportation expert, right? Because we want to be sure that, and we've got about 15 minutes tonight. Not that Lisa will be able to answer your questions, but if anyone has any questions that you know of already that you want her to start working on, let us know. You can either put them in the chat or bring them into the room. Maybe stop sharing, Marnie.
I know that the Woodstock feeding into Harrison Park is a concern, and that's something that I plan on looking at. So yeah, anything else would be greatly appreciated. I'd love to have some actual data to show you guys.
Okay, so if you have any further questions, again, get that to Megan so we can get Lisa working on that data. Megan just put the meeting evaluation form up. Dr. O, I always turn it over to you to give us a closing. And thank you everyone for your hard work tonight.
May I just ask a quick question? What kind of data is needed? Because I heard the request for data just now.
What Lisa was talking about was data on transportation.
Okay.
From the Woodstock to
Harrison Park. Okay, all right. Well, thank you all very much for a very productive night. You will all agree that we arrived at some clarity tonight, and at least our outcome or our recommendations are beginning to take some shape. On behalf of the district, I do want to thank you for your commitment. I do want to thank you also for your time investment. And though we haven't answered 100% of your questions, we're going to continue to work diligently to see that we meet all the needs that you have, at least most of them, if we can't do 100% of them. I also do want to remind everyone that our recordings are posted and that there are a lot of materials on the website. You can always revisit them. If questions emerge as a result of you going over those resources again, please feel free to contact us, share them with us, and we'll work diligently to get you the answers. Thank you to our school leaders who, on a very short notice, pivot a lot of times. I'm just always so impressed with everything else you have to do, that on a moment's notice. Today was an example. We wanted to share that data. Judy sent out the email, and quite a few of them were able to attend the meeting. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. This is all to secure our future. Please complete the feedback form before you leave tonight. Again, remember that whatever information you give us on the feedback form guides our planning and makes the meeting more productive for you as well. We will continue to work to see that Lane has the right enrollment, Harrison Park has what it needs, and our students ultimately get what they need to ensure they have a very successful academic experience. Again, we'll see you in 2 weeks. Our next meeting is on the 20th of January. Have a great night. Thank you to Megan, Brick, Karina and Brick, Architectural Firm, Jed and Flo, and everybody else who was able to attend tonight. Have a great night, and the meeting is adjourned. Drive safe, please.